Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I'd like to talk about gay men and trauma recovery, reclaiming your life. Let's start with what is trauma. So after being a gay men's specialist therapist for 30 years now, in 2022, I'm often humbled by the wonderful opportunity I have to be of service to gay men from so many different backgrounds of ages, races, ethnicities, even nationalities, and in so many fascinating professions. And after doing this for so long, you learn a lot, not just about gay men and gay male couples, but also about the world and life in general. One of those things that I see over and over is our lives, for all of us, are some combination of good experiences and bad experiences. Sometimes in the same week or the same day. When I do client work, either in therapy or coaching, which I do full-time from my home office and sometimes my commercial office in Los Angeles, I help my clients leverage their strengths in what we clinical social workers call the strengths-based perspective, which informs much of the life and career and relationship coaching work that I do too. And I help them cope with challenges, such as in therapy and learning to cope with some kind of diagnosable psychiatric disorder, from the more severe ones to the more mild ones. And that's because of my background is as a certified psychiatric social worker by training, and that came before my being an AASECT, the National Association Certified Sex Therapist. And I do a lot of both work these days, therapy and coaching, and also regular therapy and sex therapy more specifically. William Shakespeare said, "The web of our lives is of a mingled yarn, good and ill together. Our virtues would be proud if our faiths whipped them not, and our crimes would despair if they were not cherished by our virtue." That's from As You Like It. Others have theorized in a kind of religious context that living on earth is a dwelling somewhere between the hell below us and the heaven above us. And so our lives are a mix of those. Even from a secular point of view, I see that in this duality of life, we get up every day hoping for the good stuff, but as we all know, shit happens. It's like bipolar disorder. There is depression, there is mania or hypomania, and then there's baseline. And people can take a mood stabilizer medication to try to achieve that baseline of general good well-being. We are raised as kids to expect this. We're taught in general that our society is civilized, that there are rules, that we are safe. We're not necessarily barbarians or vicious animalistic creatures that devour each other and eat their young. And yet life teaches us, sometimes early on, that the sense of safety that we are collectively taught to expect from parents, teachers, bosses, clergy, cops, politicians, and so on, can be breached horrifically, leaving our physical and psychological defenses torn from the experience. It's been said that the ripping of the fabric of our psychological defenses beyond our ability to cope defines trauma. Trauma is when we get overwhelmed by an experience, either as individuals or collectively. At one time, it was defined as a life-threatening experience or experience outside the realm of normal human functioning. But the term has evolved from that, in part because it's culture-bound. What is outside normal human functioning for someone might be an everyday occurrence for someone else, such as someone living in a war zone. In trauma, the experience overwhelms our expectations and our ability to cope. We don't know what to do with it. Nobody ever taught us that such things were even possible in this world. 9/11 was such an experience collectively in the United States and in the world. No one saw that coming. It's similar to the attack historically on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in 1941 that really started the United States' involvement in World War II. It was literally awakening to a new world. And there would be plenty of non-Western examples too. Individually, trauma can take many forms. I've learned this in a heartbreaking way in my work with clients about what people, in my case gay men, go through. Childhood sexual abuse, severe or chronic illness, being born with a disability, car or other vehicle accidents, sporting accidents, workplace injuries, natural disasters, violent crime. Even nonviolent or white-collar crime can certainly be a trauma to someone. Being canceled, being doxxed online, being stalked, being catfished, having our identity stolen, being blackmailed, being abused by social institutions like a corporation or the court system or a university or an insurance company, a police force or the military, or even a neighborhood homeowners association, the loss of a loved one, a relationship breakup, the loss of a fortune, the loss of a job, the loss of one's health or appearance or money or housing or functioning or comfort or dignity. It's any time that the implied promise of that sense of safety that we were brought up as kids gets shredded by an experience that shows us otherwise. Let's talk about that, the breaking of the promise of safety. We see that implied promise of safety everywhere. Fairy tales have happily ever after. Cop shows on TV always get the bad guy in the end. Relationships kiss and make up. Lost objects are found. Curses are broken. Courtroom dramas mete out justice just in the nick of time. Audiences like a happy ending. Parents around a dinner table teach not so much what life is, but what it should be, according to sometimes very controversial values: Western, imperialist, classist, religious, heterosexist, economic, gender-burdened, some set of ideals, and it just doesn't always work that way. And when that shit happens to us, there is a certain, hey, wait a minute, this wasn't supposed to happen, what the fuck is this? And sometimes the perpetrators are the ones who taught us all about pervasive safety of the world in the first place. Like the people who were supposed to be the custodians of that safety, whom we put our profound trust in, like parents or teachers or coaches or clergy. What a mindfuck that is. So it's in that moment, the first time the rules of expected safety get broken, that trauma happens. And then we're left here just to deal with it, and only for what has happened for us. Not only that, but also this feeling of, hey, wait, what is this? You never said anything about this. So let's talk about trauma as neurobiology. Trauma can be seen as a cultural, social, and psychological phenomenon. But it's also actually a neurobiological process in our brains. That's one of the biggest differences in how therapists are trained between the time I was in graduate school in the late 80s and early 90s and when I've taught psychotherapy practice intervention models now the role of neurobiology. It's not that the psychotherapy world needs to be somehow legitimized by making it all sound more medical. It doesn't. It was always legitimate, especially if the practitioner is using what we call evidence-based practice models, which is what I taught for over 15 semesters at USC's Graduate School of Social Work as an adjunct associate professor. And unfortunately, that program has deteriorated quite a bit, because courses like that have been eliminated there, along with the school's formerly top rankings, I might add, through years of unfortunate and frankly chaotic management. But evidence-based practice models that I taught then, and better institutions still teach now, are methods of intervention that psychotherapists of all kinds, psychologists, clinical social workers, professional counselors, marriage and family therapists, etc., should be using, which have been studied and proven to be at least somewhat effective in having good clinical outcomes of the therapy with the client or the patient cohort studied. Cognitive behavioral therapy is evidence-based. Psychodynamic therapy is evidence-based. Dialectical behavioral therapy is evidence-based. Treatments like sex addiction therapy are not. And vive la différence, right? Evidence-based practice protects consumers of psychotherapy services from charlatanism. It's got to have a basis in research in order to be legitimized. It's kind of like how the Food and Drug Administration approves a medication. It has to demonstrate safety and efficacy, or they're not allowed to market it as a treatment for whatever illness or disorder. So trauma is so important to the human experience and to the human brain that a lot goes on in there, especially if we consider the brain hemispheres, the two of them, the left and the right. There's a book, Bonnie Badenbach's book, called Being a Brain-Wise Therapist, was a textbook in the program I taught in. And it's a great resource on this idea about the neurobiology of psychotherapy and the brain, including trauma recovery. And she describes how traumatic experiences are recorded in the right hemisphere of the brain, like a recording device or a video camera, and then these images and memories and feelings and themes are processed into a coherent narrative that we express by the left hemisphere of the brain through language. Hence the name talk therapy. Or other expression, like the expressive therapies, like art therapy or collage, or one of those. But it's about facilitating the expression of what we've been through and that got recorded in the brain at the time. In psychotherapy, mirror neurons between the patient and the therapist get activated, and they are really connecting on a brain-to-brain level, which all informs the therapeutic work, in addition to the good stuff like rapport and trust and the healing relationship, and preferably in a culturally competent context for the therapist, such as being a specialist in working with gay men when you are indeed working with gay men, as I am. There's a plug there. See, we couldn't get through this without a plug. So it pays to be a specialist in, I think, whatever niche market that you're working with in terms of psychotherapy and coaching services, because that specificity can end up being valuable to the client. I work with a lot of clients who worked with others who weren't gay men or weren't gay male specialists, and they want that specificity because we can really drill down to some good stuff. And in that culturally competent context, they don't have to explain themselves quite so much. But the fact that the human brain has so much going on both during and certainly after trauma tells us something. It tells us that humans know when they are facing a trauma and coping with its aftermath, just like our immune system knows what to do when faced with a foreign pathogen of illness, or if we fall down and scrape our knee. We'll form a scab, we'll heal new skin. Our body knows. And all these systems get activated toward our defense and healing. And the mind has its own version of that. So if we're brought up with, hopefully, at least some sense of safety, living life means that we eventually have to deal when there are exceptions to that sense of safety. All the systems within us, body, mind, and many would say soul, have to rally to mount an equal and opposite defensive healing response to be restored to the equilibrium of a past level of functioning before the traumatic event happened to us. In the meantime, we cope. We fake it till we make it. Sometimes for years or decades after. But that only goes so far before the full impact of the traumatic experience comes home to roost, and we get either post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD symptoms, or some variation on it, developing a substance abuse problem, compulsive habits, or some other maladaptive coping strategy that gets in our own way, that needs to be replaced by something more benevolent and more enduring in service to our own psychological healing. Perhaps there's a paradox in that part of coping with that default sense of safety in the world is just to expect and accept that there will be exceptions as we go through life. There will be times when the people that we previously trusted betray us, emotionally or physically. There will be times when our generally civilized society breaks down. There will be times when the general goodwill nature of humankind is shown to be false. When you're dealing with someone selfish or aggressive or greedy or incompetent, violent, sadistic, or just plain careless at our own expense. Exceptions to the rule of safety in our experience through life are part of the rule. Let's talk about taking our turn. When bad things happen to good people, as the old saying, and there's a book title with that goes, I call that our turn. It's very unusual, and some would say impossible, to get through this lifetime unscathed. Shit happens, either because of the above mentioned darker nature of some human beings toward others at times, or because Mother Nature's a bitch and can harm us with a good old-fashioned natural disaster that causes loss. Taking our turn at having a trauma can take many different forms. But somewhere, someday, it happens. Probably to all of us. Maybe multiple times in a lifetime, and for different reasons. Just because you've been through one trauma doesn't mean you won't go through another. A Holocaust survivor might have her purse snatched while taking a leisurely walk down the street 70 years later. Somebody who's just been laid off from their job 6 weeks before retirement eligibility can come home to a house that's been burglarized. A childhood sexual abuse survivor can discover their law partner embezzled and now they're facing bankruptcy at the firm. Those are taking their turns, and it's frustrating how it is true that some people, truly through no fault of their own, have more than their fair share of trauma. This is something I've actually worked with a lot of clients on this because it's an existential dilemma. Some people have just had more than their fair share of shit happen to them, and it truly is through no fault of their own. And I've also seen the opposite, where someone seems to be born under a star and had consistently uncanny good luck over many years and is essentially free from trauma. If you think about the people you know, your friends, your colleagues, your family, you might find people who seem to have been through more than their fair share of shit, and then others who seem to have kind of a charmed life. And that's kind of some kind of social human variation. And it's the existential challenge we all face. No matter what it is, as a trauma, it happens. We can't always prevent it, but we can cope with it after it happens. Some of my favorite adages for this, for coping, when people say, okay, fine, trauma, but what do we do about it? Some good stuff from self-help books. Jack Canfield, in his book, The Success Principles, discusses how event plus response equals outcome. We can't prevent the event from happening to us, but it is our adaptive coping response versus a maladaptive one that makes the difference in the ultimate outcome. New Age author Louise Hay had another adage about facing any challenge, anything that comes along. She said, just sit back and say to yourself, how can I take a positive approach to this? How can I take a positive approach to this? And that guides you with your best cognitive and behavioral choices that make the most of an admittedly bad situation. Let's talk about life after safety. So when we cross that threshold after a trauma at whatever age and in whatever circumstance or experiences we have, it is said that we live in a different world from the one that we knew before. It's a sense of lost innocence. Certainly that's been illustrated in discussions of 9/11. But somehow life goes on. We have to make a go of it in survival, as there really is no other choice, except to live a broken, shattered experience, as some sadly do. But we have to find a way to go on, even if it's just with a little more cynicism about the world and its people, or certainly its circumstances. And as the great show tune from Ragtime says, we can never go back to before. Life moves in one direction, forward. And that was the last line of Maggie Smith as Lady Grantham in the original television run of Downton Abbey. she said after that line was said to her, her friend says that to her, life moves in one direction forward, and Lady Grantham says, yes, but only if we had the choice. She would have gone back to a simpler time if she could. So life after safety means living with not so much a sense of safety all the time, but with a modified safety. That although we continue to live in a world where bad stuff happens, either to us or someone we care about, or even people who seem remote to us, but we still care about them, it's with that sense that despite the bad stuff happens in our lives occasionally, and there can be many times, some might say most moments are still worth living. We live with the notion that as people go, in general, it is human nature to be sane, reasonably well-behaved, basically law-abiding, and generally of goodwill to most people most of the time. The odds are in our favor that everything will be fine. The majority, although this is kind of questioned in the current political climate in the United States, where nearly half of its people support a disgraced former president who supported a violent coup attempt and are willing to revoke civil rights from women and others, we know that stuff can happen, but we can go along hoping that it doesn't and doing our best to influence that in our favor. And it generally works. We wear a seatbelt, we lock our doors, we watch our back, we take care of our health in various ways, we manage our finances. Our efforts try to keep life stable and reasonably rewarding, even fun and productive. Let's talk about reclaiming our rights. So when we talk about trauma recovery, once something bad has happened to us, or even a series of things, the number one word I use with clients in sessions who are trauma survivors is reclaiming. How do we reclaim our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness after some schmuck or the personification of a natural disaster or some non-personified force has messed it all up for us? In my clinical work, I talk about the importance of rallying external resources like therapists, books, videos, commercial products, service providers, support of others, educational materials. All of those can help stabilize us, along with medications or a good bed or good food or good exercise. And I talk about rallying our internal resources. Those are the ones you can't really see, but things like what's in us with determination or stamina or courage or persistence, boy, that's a good one, tenacity, resiliency, and quite a bit of resolve. This is how it's going to be because I say so. And it is when we activate our ability to rally both the internal and external resources that we begin to fight the good fight back to functioning after trauma. Cognitively, in our minds, we must reframe our experiences from being victims of others, including nature's behaviors, to being survivors of the experience. What they or it did to us is not the final word. We're not down for the count, as they say in boxing. Cher's song, "You Haven't Seen the Last of Me," which was written by the very prolific composer and lyricist Diane Warren, that Cher sang in the movie Burlesque, comes to mind. And there are many inspirational songs that help rally one's defenses to trauma and inspire us. Especially for gay men, we love our music divas. If you go to my website, gaytherapyla.com/blog, I have a blog article called The Power Playlist, and it gives some examples about the great gay icon divas like Cher and Tina Turner and Barbra Streisand, and inspirational songs. But every generation has them. I think every person has them. And from a music therapy standpoint, I think these can help. I think listening to determined, hopeful, inspirational songs can really help change our mood and reframe ourselves from despair to optimism. I really believe in the power of music that way. We live on to have internal conversations or even confrontations with our perpetrators. whether in reality, which it's rare or even impossible if the person's gone or dead, in our heads. We have to fight back that what they tried to take away from us and their aggressive acts of greed or selfishness or self-indulgence or entitlement or even sadism, that's not the last word. We have the last word. We pick up the responsibility for the atrocity and absolve ourselves of any sense of fault about it and drop it back squarely into the lap of the perpetrator who harmed us. This is where the word victim can be useful at times, not to lead us into defeatism and despair, but to validate our feelings and the fact that we were minding our own damn business, doing our work, driving our car, walking down the street, sleeping, doing whatever, and they came along to mess it up by doing something that they had no right to do, legally, morally, or socially, and the fault lies with them. And while many survivors of trauma have trouble coming to terms with this, it's important to do the work of just clarifying that point. There are actually perpetrators and victims in a lot of situations, and what they did to us was wrong. I say that a lot with childhood sexual abuse survivors, which happens a lot with gay men. I don't know that it happens more than with straight boys, but it certainly happens with a lot of the guys that I've worked with. And we have to kind of understand that the situation was kind of black and white. If we were minding our own business and somebody breached our human rights, okay, that's wrong. And that's in any religion or social construct or philosophy. Even our brain's neurological makeup knows that it's wrong because it's not in line with how humans generally work or should. Our defenses come from deep evolutionary experiences that go beyond us. They go into our ancestry and heritage and our evolution as humans. Because even a child with no formal education yet knows that an adult should not be sexual with them. It's developmentally inappropriate. Even if they don't know what's really going on, they don't have a name for it or a vocabulary, they still know it's wrong. It's instinctive. It's not just cultural or social. In every society, harming someone's person is wrong. Humans aren't built for that. In every society, taking something that isn't yours is wrong, because we each have our own resources. These are things that transcend geography and culture and historical time. Even if just in our own minds we talk back to our perpetrators, and I believe in the importance of a healthy anger that restores our dignity against someone who would cross us. It's not just back off to reclaim our rights, it's back off, motherfucker. The healthy anger validates our inherent human rights, which have been violated, which transcends demographics, cultures, nations, historical time periods. We affirm in trauma recovery that we have basic human rights to live reasonably comfortably, to be with those we love if we want, to be left alone if we want, to control our own resources of possessions or money or our domicile, our home, to control our own bodies and who touches them and when and where and why. We had rights. The perpetrator violated those rights with their own sadistic self-indulgence, and we retaliate for justice to not only reclaim what was ours, but to punish those who would even attempt to take our human rights away from us. That's like punitive damages in a lawsuit. They make others think twice before committing the same act against anyone in society. And they discourage others from even considering doing the same. That's really our justice system when it works as it should, although that's another whole story. In our justice system, sometimes, even often, justice isn't served, but we know the truth of it. In our heart of hearts, we know what happened. Even in those times when we can't prove it, or even if we can't remember all of it exactly. I work with clients on this. They sometimes don't know all the details as much as they just know the feelings that the traumatic event caused, sometimes many, many years later. Sometimes, the one with privilege, the boss, the elected official, the cop, the rich one, the connected one, the protected one, the powerful one, they win the battle, and they get away with it in a court case or some kind of investigation or something. But even then, we reclaim in our own minds and hearts, we know the score. We know what happened. It would be nice if others did too, like in a court of law, but we don't need for justice to always be served for us to reclaim our rights and move on. We just have to trust in karma for their ultimate punishment, however long that takes, while we achieve that living well is the best revenge. In my work with clients, we identify ways to play out what living well might mean for them after we reclaim our rights from whatever happened to us that seemed to take those rights away. Let's talk about living well. Living well means that we assert the rights we always had, but with a renewed vigor, for a positive self-esteem and self-concept, for good health, for good relationships, for professional satisfaction, for opportunities for joy, for the opportunity to fulfill roles that we want to have as adult child or parent or sibling or worker or neighbor or colleague or lover or friend or compatriot. If someone took those rights away for a bit, well, no longer. There's a new sheriff in town, and grieving time is over. Maya Angelou's poem, "And Still I Rise," is a wonderful expression of this feeling of reclaiming your power after it's been, temporarily lost. Let's talk about forgive and forget. Trauma has a very special relationship to memory for us as people. It's a neurobiological thing, too, as the concept of body memory. And some of the evidence-based psychotherapy models are around that. Somatic experiencing, some other psychotherapy models you might hear about. Some of them I use, some of them I don't. Each therapist kind of chooses their own repertoire of which, preferably evidence-based models, they're going to keep in their repertoire. I tend to use a cognitive behavioral approach with trauma. But we remember, even if some details are hazy many years later or even immediately after what happened to us. And we remember because they are memories that we feel, often profoundly, deeply. And sometimes we feel so profoundly that our defenses don't let us remember all of it. The memories are set aside. Even though stuff about repressed memory syndrome has been largely debunked. That was a very illegitimate psychotherapeutic concept that was popular for a while, especially in the late 80s. And that's kind of its own discussion. And therapists can be guilty sometimes of getting into fads. Repressed memory syndrome was a fad, rebirthing was a fad, sex addiction is a fad, all these fad things that really delegitimize psychotherapy because they're not evidence-based practice. But when it comes to traumatic memories, if you've been through a trauma, you probably feel this yourself. There are parts that you remember and parts that you don't. And part of that is because we just don't want to think about it. What's too painful to remember, we simply choose to forget, as gay icon Barbra Streisand sang in The Way We Were. So it's hard to even think about forgive and forget when it comes to trauma with our perpetrators. There's so many philosophical and religious and New Age books talk about the importance of forgiveness and how holding on to a resentment is a poison for someone else that we end up drinking ourselves. And I'm not sure I agree with that. Many writings have discussed how forgiveness, as such, is not a requirement for healing and moving on with your life. Your own circumstances and personal value system or your culture or your family or religion might dictate whether or not you consciously forgive your perpetrator. I don't really believe in forgiveness if there has been no justice and no accountability or remorse from a human perpetrator. This is why unremorseful criminals are rarely granted parole out of jail. Many believe there is no forgiveness without contrition, or at least an acknowledgement of the harm they caused and its impact on other people. Gay men who have been the victim of anti-gay violence, physical or emotional, know all about this. But whether you forgive your human perpetrator or just perhaps maybe learn to understand their behavior in a different context over time, such as if they had a psychiatric disorder like a personality disorder or a criminal psychosis, we can still move on. Let's talk about others in this process. Our adaptive coping after trauma involves a lot of work, especially in interpersonal relationships. The relationship to ourselves, when we forgive ourselves of any aspect that we hold ourselves in contempt for. Gee, if I hadn't been lazy and taken a shortcut down the dark alley, I never would have been mugged by that gunman. We have to forgive ourselves about that. We had a right not to be mugged or whatever it was, whether we went in direction down Main Street or whether we took 100 dark alleys. We cope with professionals. When I work with clients, trauma survivors, I have to earn their trust. It would be presumptuous of me to expect it or demand it right at the start. I have to earn it through a professional working relationship over time, because it was probably someone they initially trusted that perpetrated against them in the first place. We cope with spouses and partners and significant others. We might have been the one who experienced the trauma and have the symptoms and the dysfunction as a result of it, but they are the partners of someone dealing with trauma. And that's its own challenge. I work with guys like this all the time because the survivor needs support, but the partners and the spouses of survivors need support too. It's a whole system. And I think of even gay male couples as being a two-person family system, and of course even more so if they have kids or if it's a polycule, like a throuple relationship or more in polyamorous relationships. And this is why trauma sucks, because there is just so much work to do. Especially when we think that maybe somehow it was all preventable. Let's talk about how life goes on. After trauma, life does indeed go on. The sun also rises. It doesn't care. Sometimes you're happy and sometimes you're sad, but the world goes round, as Broadway lyricist Fred Ebb wrote in a song for another gay icon, Liza Minnelli. One day it's kicks, then it's kicks in the shins, but the planet spins and the world goes round and round. So, how is our ride going to be? Can we learn to live in a post-safety world? Can we take the good with the bad, even though we really, really had hoped it had been different and better? We didn't want this fight, but we got it. It came to us, and we had to fight back, even though we didn't want the fight in the first place. Let's talk about making meaning. We didn't want the fight. We're mad we were even put in that position in the first place, but we're here. And maybe the next best thing to it not having happened at all is that we learn to cope with it. We try to find meaning that even in our challenges, even in our traumas, they might not be pleasant, but they can be educational, informative, fascinating, poignant, and meaningful. Maybe we knew something important that we didn't know before. Maybe we learned that we have something in us that we didn't know we had before. Maybe we just had to learn to trust that the ruby slippers can take us home anytime we wish, but we had to learn it for ourselves. How can I take a positive approach to this? Event plus response equals outcome. You haven't seen the last of me. And the world goes round and round. So if you would like help or support for the traumas you've faced in your life, or help making your own world go round, please consider therapy for residents of California or coaching services in other states or even other countries if you're hearing this. If you're looking for a public speaker, I do that. If you're looking for an expert witness in LGBT plus or HIV/AIDS issues or some other things, I do that. And for more information on all of this, you can email me, ken@gaytherapyla.com. I'll repeat the website, gaytherapyla.com. Or you can call me, or preferably text me, at area code in the United States at area code 310-339-5778. Thanks. I'll see you next time.